disaster declaration of January 8th, 2020. The determination is made that in-person meeting is not practical and prudent for the boards to ensure the transparency of Open Meetings Act as possible. The meeting materials were posted online a week in advance. Recording of this meeting will be provided and linked to our website, and all votes will be taken by roll call. With that in mind, Aaron, call the roll.
Great, thank you. Mayor Bennett?
Present.
Rita Athos? Frank Beal?
Present.
President Brawley? Commissioner Cox? Mayor Darch?
Present.
Jim Healy?
Present.
Mayor Noak?
Here.
President Reinbold?
Present.
Mayor Rodering?
Here.
Carolyn Schofield?
Here.
Deputy Mayor Sheehan?
Here.
Matt Walsh?
Here.
Diane Williams?
Present.
And Leanne Redden? And
I'm
Dr.
here, but
Mohammadian.
muted.
Sorry, hi Leanne.
Hi.
And Dr. Mohammadian?
Present, yeah.
Thank
Morning.
you.
Good
We have a
morning.
quorum.
Welcome. There is a quorum. And first item on the agenda is approval of the minutes of February. Aaron, again, you want to call the roll?
Yes, any changes? Or we need to get a motion.
Oh,
So
I'm sorry.
moved.
I'm sorry. Moved by Mayor Darch, seconded. I'm sorry.
Diane Williams.
Moved and seconded. And again, any comments or questions? If not, Aaron, call the roll.
Mayor Bennett?
Yes.
Rita Athos? Frank Beal?
Yes.
President Brawley? Commissioner Cox? Mayor Darch?
Yes.
Jim Healy?
Yes.
Mayor Noak?
Yes.
President Reinbold?
Yes.
Mayor Rodering?
Yes.
Carolyn Schofield?
Yes.
Deputy Mayor Sheehan?
Yes.
Matt Walsh?
Yes.
And Diane Williams.
Yes.
Motion
And
carries.
the motion carries. Aaron, you have your executive director's report.
Yeah, thank you. At the January board meeting, CMAP staff presented on an overview of our mobility recovery project. And, this initiative will help the agency and our partners better understand and plan for the impacts of COVID-19 on our transportation system. Since we presented to you last in January, we've hosted our first steering committee meeting where we brought together partners from transportation implementation organizations, federal partners, all 7 counties, as well as civic and nonprofit leaders. The steering committee members provided us with feedback on the initial approach of developing a policy framework and financial sustainability of these systems overall. So just as a reminder, this work will culminate in an actionable plan to keep the region on track to meet the transportation goals of 2050. And the team will use newly available data to evaluate program and policy solutions to sustain the region's transit system and mitigate a likely rebound in congestion. Again, the project's just getting underway, but in the coming months, we'll continue to bring you initial findings in advance of the final action plan, which will be in fall of 2022. And we're hoping all of this work really helps us roll right into it'll be rolled into the plan update. And then as we start thinking about sort of what the next iteration of the long range plan this will put us on a good footing there. In terms of regional meetings, last month I participated in Cook County's Transit Plan Steering Committee. This plan seeks to increase overall transit ridership and the seamlessness of transit service and focus on the needs of transit-reliant communities. These all align with CMAP's goals of seeking opportunities to prioritize investment in communities of need. I recently also met with the Department of Transportation, the Illinois Department of Transportation, to talk about how we've been using our cohort tool to think about our shared fund programming, as well as how we utilize that tool with Cook County as they thought about distribution for their CARES Act funding. And then we also shared with IDOT upcoming work on fares, fines, and fees, which you'll hear more about today, and our approach to equitable engagement. So, and closely aligned with IDOT's mission is safety. And so we've been continuing to keep them informed and have their participation in our safety action plan approach. I'll also note for the committee that we had our call for projects jointly with the Regional Transportation Authority, and we will be assisting dozens of high-need communities with long-term planning projects. Selected projects span northeastern Illinois from Waukegan and northern Lake County to Robbins and southern Cook. Just to give you a sampling of the projects that were selected in Robbins, staff will be working with local officials to implement previous recommendations related to flooding issues that aim to spur economic development and create new opportunities for recreation. We're also pairing with high need communities such as Berkeley and Harvey with low need communities. So again, we're pairing high need communities with communities that have the capacity to give them the opportunity to learn more about creative uses for public spaces that have developed since the pandemic. Things like open streets, outdoor dining, pop-up markets, to hopefully build some capacity amongst our constituencies and our base of communities across the region. Just overall, the program received requests from 27 high and very high need communities, and this call was really targeted on making sure that we were addressing communities that needed the most assistance. And then we believe we'll be able to select and provide support to 22 of those communities. A couple other things I just wanted to mention this morning, transportation analysis. We put out a new analysis of traffic volumes. We continue to see that there's been a decrease in traffic volumes across all vehicle classes, including commercial vehicles within the past few months. We think that this is likely a result of the mitigation efforts in place as cases began to surge in the late fall. We're going to continue to monitor the traffic patterns and volumes and have another update in a month or so for you. And then on Monday, we held a CMAP Talks webinar on International Women's Day to discuss the economic impacts of the pandemic on women of color in Illinois and in our region specifically. So I'll just note that the labor participation for women is at its lowest point since 1988. And in Illinois, that translates to about 250,000 fewer women employed in 2020 than in the previous year. We had a great panel discussion with Congresswoman Underwood, Dr. Helene Gale from the Chicago Community Trust, President Karen Freeman Wilson of the Chicago Urban League, and Noreen Shugru from the Latino Policy Forum. So it was a great event and something we hope to bring more of the solutions to our partners as well. And then I'll just lastly note that our local dues to date, we have collected about 36% of our local dues for FY21. We are in the process of contacting communities and we'll be sending out past due notices next week. So we will also be talking about our budget and work plan and seeking your approval on that this month. With that, that concludes my report.
Thanks, Erin. Any questions of Erin? If not, we'll move on to item 5, which are all the procurements and contracts for approval. Angela?
I'm sorry, I was on mute. I'm sorry. Good morning, CMAP board. Today I'm seeking board approval for 5 procurements. I'm seeking approval to enter into an agreement with Civil Tech Engineering to conduct South Suburban Cook County truck routing and community study. I'm also seeking approval to enter into a sole source agreement with Baker Tilly to conduct an updated compensation study for the agency in fiscal year 21. Seeking approval to enter into agreement with Aon Consulting under a current GSA contract to develop CMAP's diversity, equity, and inclusion roadmap. Seeking approval to enter into an agreement with the Center for Neighborhood Technology to develop an equitable engagement program. And finally, I'm seeking approval for a vendor limit increase for Wright Harima Architect to close out the old post office construction project. Many of these projects we did talk about last month. They were part of the presentation of the work plan, but I'm definitely happy to answer any questions at this time.
Any questions of Angela?
Motion to approve all of them.
I had a question.
Sure. Question first.
I had 2 questions. One what was the staff surprised to find on the truck routing and community study that there only a single vendor applied? Number 1. The second question is, why did you split the study area into 2 separate studies? They're adjacent to each other, they're similar characteristics, needs.
So I'll speak to the first one and I'll let Stephanie, I believe she's on the call, speak to the second one. But yes, of course, when we put out an RFP, we're always hoping to get multiple responses. So we were definitely surprised. I think I included in the memo, this vendor was a responsive vendor to the other part of the study, the first RFP that we let. But again, our goal is to always get multiple responses, and we were surprised to get just one. And I'll let Stephanie speak to the second part of your question, Frank. I
Thank
see
you.
she's on the call.
Good morning. Yes, so the vendor that we did receive, because it is consistent, we were happy with that proposal. And as far as the study, really splitting it up so that we could make sure that we were being detailed enough to identify the different issues in the sub areas. And that was really the reason for the approach.
Thank you.
Other questions?
Jerry, I had a question, and I probably should know this if Angela presented before. On the CNT contract, I think it's for not to exceed 500,000, $500,000. I think it's our biggest one on here. Just the time frame that study will cover, or that program will cover. And, you know, I was surprised by the price, but is it a number of people who will be doing it? Is that kind of what's
Sure, I
driving?
can give you some insight on that, and happy to have Laura chime in as well. I believe this is a 3.5 to 4 year program.
Got it.
A large component of the cost is the stipends. So there's a stipend component that will be paid out to the organizations for their participation in the engagement program. But Laura can definitely, provide a more detailed response. But it's about almost a 4-year project, 4-year program, I should say.
Great.
Yeah,
So
I don't
that's-
really have anything to add. I think you covered it, Angela, with the timing and the stipends, but happy to answer any other questions.
Great. Yeah, no, the timing was kind of key to me. Thanks.
I had a
know
Other question?
there was
I
one
had-
other question. Oh, I'm sorry, Carolyn, did you have a question?
Well, I have a question kind of continuing on that same, the 5.4 with the CNT. Not so much a question as it is a comment on, I mean, this is obviously a large project that they're going to be participating in. And I just wanted to point out, as one that represents one of the furthest suburban areas within this region, that the importance of the suburbs being engaged in this, as well as the urban areas. And I know it's a really huge task to take on with the equity and the whole entire region, because it varies so greatly. And I just think it's worthy of making that point, that the needs of the suburbs, and even within those suburbs, the needs change. So I hope that it's all included within this, that it's all taken into consideration, so we can address needs, how they vary between the urban areas, the suburban areas, and even within those areas, there's different needs that need to be addressed. So hopefully it includes all of it. And I know it's a large project and a large ask, but I just wanted to point out those variations within the region, and hope that we include all of it.
Carolyn, I think that's a really important consideration. So if you don't mind, I'll just weigh in here. One of the things as we were developing this proposal, we know that there are lots of organizations in the city of Chicago and in Cook County as well, that are dealing with transportation equity, that are dealing with environmental justice issues, that are dealing with housing equity. But as we move further out into the suburbs, I think our ability to reach out to folks and making sure that we're getting representation is of critical importance. And so that's why, instead of going with, an existing structure that we know is well established, but not as well established in the region, the goal here is to develop sort of that framework together jointly. And think about sort of the nuances of how we apply this lens of equity to all of our region specifically. So that's our hope as we kick this project off. Task 1 will be really thinking and digging into what that means for all communities across the region, and really sort of specifying how this work gets done in meaningful ways across the region. So I am encouraged and appreciate the board's continued, elevation of the needs across our region. I noticed also.
And I appreciate your comments that, we need to kind of reinvent this, because I do think we are in unprecedented times where we need to really move forward rather than continue with what we've been doing. So I appreciate those comments. Thank you.
Somebody else?
I have one other thing, and I had motion to go ahead and approve them all as Mayor Noak. One other thing I want to mention too on the truck routing, and it alludes to the previous one we've done for Will. Just a reminder for those listening and just a general reminder that these are studies that are meant to be advisory. They are not binding. There was a lot of miscommunication on the Will County one. It continues to be, with an implication that the study itself is binding. And I think it's important that we once again reiterate that any kind of conclusions from these studies are ultimately for the locals to decide how that they are implemented. But I also motion to approve all the list.
Moved by Mayor Noak. Was there a second? If I missed it.
Second, Ann Sheehan.
Moved and seconded. And again, any further questions? And this is for approval of all 5 of the contracts. Aaron, call the roll.
Yes, it is. Mayor Bennett,
Yes.
Rita Athos, Frank Beal,
Yes.
President Brawley, Commissioner Cox, Mayor Darch,
Yes.
Jim Healy,
Healy votes aye.
Mayor Noak,
Yes.
President Reinbold,
Yes.
Mayor Rodering,
Yes.
Carolyn Schofield,
Yes.
Deputy Mayor Sheehan,
Yes.
Matt Wall,
Yes.
Diane Williams,
Yes.
and Chair, I'll ask you to recognize the Rita Athos here. Rita, I saw you maybe trying to unmute yourself there.
The chair recognizes Rita. Hi, Rita. And the motion carries.
Hi, everyone.
You're late. We fine everybody $50 for being late. All right, moving on. Item 6. Again, this item was brought up at our last meeting. And Angela, you want to make the presentation?
Sure. I'll go through some highlights for the 22 budget and the UWP. A lot of it's a recap from our last presentation, but so today I'm submitting for your approval the 22 work plan and budget, which incorporates 22 UWP budget. Last month, as I mentioned, staff presented the work plan and budget that outlined the work that would be accomplished in the coming fiscal year. During that presentation, I provided highlights of the budget, and I'm happy to recap them again today. Under the annual comprehensive budget, CMAP is requesting $22.3 million in expenditures with revenues of $23.5 million. And so our revenues are down about $2.3 million when compared to prior fiscal year. Our revenues are comprised of 77.7% federal funding, 17.9% state funding, 3.8% local dues, and less than 1% from other sources, including philanthropic grants, the Peter Fellow Program, rent reimbursement, and interest income generated from CMAP banking activities. The reductions in revenues are primarily due to large-scale projects being completed in fiscal year 21 and 22 that were funded by SPR grants, the MacArthur Foundation, Illinois Environmental Protection Agency, and local contributions. On the expenditure side, our total expenses are down $650,000, about 3% over the prior fiscal year. Increases are noted in the areas of personnel, occupancy, and commodity expenses, and decreased expenses are noted in the area of contractual services. Expenses in operating and capital outlay were relatively flat or unchanged in 22. The largest increase in personal expenses of $713,000 is primarily driven by approved changes in the 21 work plan and budget to reallocate $970,000 in personal costs to contractual expenses to hire experts to focus on assisting partners in developing new strategies for regional transportation post-COVID-19. This increase reflects reinstatement of that funding to our personnel line to hire staff to complete the work outlined in the work plan. Increases in occupancy expenses were related to our increases in rent, real estate taxes, and operating costs as outlined in our lease with the old post office. And I just want to say that, compared to what the market is doing today, we still have below market rents in the central business district. So we have really good rent rates at this time. And expenses under the categories of commodity reflected an increase of $165,000 And this is due to data required for research and analysis work for the On to 2050 plan update. Our largest decrease for fiscal year 22 is under the category of contractual expenses, 1.5 million. As I mentioned, several large-scale projects will be completed soon. In addition, call for projects funded by IDOT's SBR grants and the UWP competitive program will not be conducted next fiscal year, which further reduced available contractual dollars available to the agency. I'll do a quick recap of the UWP budget. I can stop there for questions, or I can continue on with the UWP part.
Again, any questions on the budget first? Go ahead, Angela.
Okay, so I'll do a quick recap of the UWP itself. In the 22 comprehensive budget, included in the 22 comprehensive budget, I'm sorry, is 18.7 million of federal funding from the UWP program. So as we're aware, with the expiration of FAST Act and the one-year extension provided by the federal government, our federal funding for 22 is unchanged. And with the required match, the total UWP program for 22 is expected to be 23.4 million. As approved by the UWP committee, there will be no competitive program in 22, and the funding was redirected to the core program to fund UWP agencies' operational programs. The competitive program will be evaluated. It's actually under evaluation now over the remainder of this current fiscal year to develop a program that incorporates stronger performance measures and a more efficient expenditure of resources. And a new UWP competitive program will be introduced with the FY23 budget process. For 22 under the UWP program, we received 8 core proposals. They're listed in your package. They're in the UWP budget document in addition to your memo. Proposals submitted total 23.4 million, of which 18.7 was for federal funds. UWP partners this year were fully funded under their operational programs and received increases anywhere between 4 to 59%, depending on the request. And CMAP funding increased by less than 1%. So this budget, the UWP budget this year, reflects our efforts to ensure that CMAP remains operational, and it provides for the 4 transportation planning dollars for the City of Chicago, the Council of Mayors, McHenry County, and all of our transit partners. And so at this time, I'm requesting approval from the board for the FY22 work plan and budget. In addition, I'm seeking approval for the FY22 budget today. And I'm definitely happy to answer any questions at this time.
Any questions first?
A lot of numbers, I'm sorry.
It's all right. It's the second time we've gone through it, so. All right, with that in mind, I'll entertain a motion that we I'll entertain a motion to accept both the unified UWP and the budget and work plan as one motion. Is there a motion?
Motion to approve, Noak.
Second, Reinbold.
Moved and seconded. Again, any further comments or questions? Aaron, call the roll.
Mayor Bennett,
Yes.
Rita Athos,
Yes.
Frank Beal,
Yes.
President Brawley, Commissioner Cox, Chair Darch,
Yes.
Jim Healy,
Jim Healy votes aye.
Mayor Noak,
Yes.
President Reinbold,
Yes.
Mayor Rodering,
Yes.
Carolyn Schofield,
Yes.
Deputy Mayor Sheehan,
Yes.
Matt Walsh,
Yes.
and Diane Williams.
Yes.
Motion carries.
And the motion carries.
Thank you,
Thank
board.
you. Thank you. All right, moving on to item number 7. Aaron, this is on the asset conditions and target safeties for approval.
This is, and we have a pre-recorded video for this that'll walk us through. We are looking for approval today for both the transit safety targets, which are new, and the pavement condition targets, which you've approved previously. We brought both of these to Transportation Committee for a discussion a couple weeks ago, and we're moving approval today for the board and tomorrow for the Employee Policy Committee. These are federal performance measure requirements. With that, I think we can play.
Good morning. I'm going to be talking about 2 of our federal required performance measures today. Transit safety is new to CMAP, and the pavement condition measures are a revised methodology. These performance measures are part of the federal effort to encourage performance-based programming at all levels of transportation decision-making. Federal rulemaking for performance measures coming out of MAP 21 and the FAST Act were grouped into 5 areas. States, MPOs, and transit agencies are required to set targets and track progress towards achievement. Targets for the first 4 areas listed on this slide were adopted as part of the On to 2050 plan in 2018. The Transit Safety Rule, number 5, was still being finalized at that time. Staff will be examining all of these measures over the next year and a half in preparation for the On to 2050 update in 2022. As detailed in the memos included in your meeting packet, we will be asking for approval of the following targets. We will start with transit safety. For both measures we discussed today, we have collaborated with key partners in developing the targets. While the current federal rule only directly applies to CTA and PACE, CMAP hosted 2 transit safety roundtables that also included METRA, IDOT, Federal Transit Administration, and the RTA. CTA and PACE were required to develop detailed safety plans that bring new accountability and consistency for their safety work. METRA is also developing a safety plan under the Federal Railroad Administration rules. But MPOs are not required to set safety targets for commuter rail. In their safety plans, CTA and PACE set ambitious but achievable targets that align with CMAP's past safety targets and efforts. CMAP staff recommend supporting targets that are based on targets set by CTA and PACE. The regional targets shown here are the same as those adopted by the transit agencies, with the exception of the bus targets, where the regional targets are a weighted blend of CTA and PACE. There are 4 target areas with a target value and rate for the first 3. Similar to highway targets, measures of fatalities and serious injuries are included. Transit agencies are also required to track safety events, such as collisions, fires, spills, and some crimes. The final measure tracks reliability, measured as the mean distance between mechanical failure. This is the only measure where a higher value is better. The Highway Asset Condition Performance Area, known as PM2, covers pavement and bridge condition on the national highway system. Targets were set for bridges and pavement with onto 2050. However, CMAP used a methodology for pavement that was temporarily allowed until data for the official federal method was available. That data is now available, so we are updating our targets accordingly. There are 4 federal measures for pavement condition, 2 for interstates and 2 for non-interstate national highway system roads. The first column shows the baseline data that was available to set onto 2050 targets. This data only used the International Roughness Index, or IRI methodology, to assess pavement condition. The next column, labeled CMAP 4-year target, is the target set using that baseline data. The last column are IDOT new pavement targets, which use a more comprehensive data set that is now available. These targets align with their Transportation Asset Management Plan, or TAMP. The IDOT TAMP calls for moving away from a worst-first approach to a more strategic investment strategy that programs projects throughout the roadway pavement lifecycle, an approach that CMAP has advocated for. Therefore, staff recommend that the board and MPO support these new IDOT pavement condition targets. Adopting targets is just one step in the performance programming cycle. Staff will continue to work with IDOT and the transit agencies to understand their efforts and identify ways for CMAP and our partners to contribute. All federal performance measures will be revised along with the ON2 2050 update in 2022. Staff will be working with committees to update targets over the next year and a half. In closing, we are seeking approval for both sets of targets. I would be happy to answer any questions.
Any questions?
Mayor
Jerry?
Bennett, this is Rita. I just wanted to, I think it's great we have the targets, but how does it get implemented? Is there a work plan that goes along with that, or, something more detailed that says, here's where we're going, but here's how we're going to get there?
Aaron?
Martin, you can go ahead and start and I'll add on.
So on the transit side, both transit agencies were required to develop transit safety plans. So there's actually a highway, sorry, not a highway, a rail safety plan, a CTA bus safety plan, and a PACE safety plan. So the targets are just one piece of their overall effort, and they have detailed plans that detail how they're going to achieve those. On the pavement side, it's very similar. IDOT has a TAMP plan that I mentioned, the Transportation Asset Management Plan, and that details all the efforts they're undertaking and how they plan to achieve those targets. So.
And do we check in periodically, or do they give us reports periodically on how that's progressing?
So we receive an update pretty much once a year, sort of a data update. They're also required to, on the roadway side, they're required to publish a mid-period performance report, which has sort of their progress on all of their targets every 2 years. So, and then we have regular check-ins with the transit agencies to sort of talk about their safety targets. IDOT actually hosts a quarterly safety meeting with CTA to talk about safety.
Okay, thank you.
And if I could, oh, go ahead, Mayor. Mayor Rodering, did you comment?
Motion to approve.
Motion to approve.
The chair will recognize that first motion. Is there a second?
Second.
Moved by
Karen Darch, second.
Karen Dutch, I'm sorry. Again, any further questions, comments? Again, the motion will be to accept both the proposals, the 2020 transit safety targets and the 2020 pavement condition targets together. No further questions or comments. Aaron, read the roll call.
Mayor Bennett,
Yes.
Rita Affis,
Yes.
Frank Beal,
Yes.
President Brawley, Commissioner Cox, Mayor Darch,
Yes.
Jim Healy,
Healy votes aye.
Mayor Noak,
Yes.
President Reinbold,
Yes.
Mayor Rodering,
Yes.
Carolyn Schofield,
Yes.
Deputy Mayor Sheehan,
Yes.
Matt Walsh,
Yes.
and Diane Williams.
Yes.
The motion carries.
If I could just add briefly to, the federal transportation bill set these performance targets in MAP 21, and we're now under the FAST Act. So it took them quite a bit of time to figure out how they wanted to measure these performance measurements that they put forth. And I'll say that we're still working through how best we can support the implementation of these, because we approve them at a regional level, but often we aren't the ultimate implementer of these. So we've seen from our programmatic side on the roads and bridges side, that's really where fundamentally this idea that our region should look at the conditions of our roads locally to help support and further that measurement. So, it's really like one of those things, until you start measuring and being held accountable for, understanding what the strategies you have to take to make a difference takes some time to figure out. On the safety side too, I'll say that the Transportation Committee's proactive ask of us to help get involved in safety planning and considering what we might be able to do as a region, I think is in a direct reaction to support the implementation of the reduction of fatalities and serious injuries across our region. So I would expect that as these continue to move forward, we will iterate and figure out what our best role is in order to help support the region's implementers achieve the goals that we're also being held accountable for here. So thank you.
Thank you, Aaron. Under item 8, equity and fees, fines and fares presentation, Lindsay.
Yes, good morning.
Good morning.
I'm Lindsay Hollander, and I'm here to present on our project where we've spent about the past year and a half looking at the equity in transportation in fees, fines, and fares. Next slide, please. So our goals with this project, we wanted to really explore how Onto 2050 recommendations to use user fees to fully fund the transportation system could be reconciled with other Onto 2050 recommendations to leverage the transportation network to promote inclusive growth. And we wanted to assess how affordable transportation fees, fines, and fares are for residents with low income, but also outcomes and consequences of those impacts, including for how residents are able to access the transportation network. And we intend to publish a report on our findings this spring. Next slide, please. So our goals were really twofold. We've focused on assessing equity impacts on residents with low income, but our goal is also to develop strategies to reduce any disproportionate impacts that we observed through our analysis. Next slide. Throughout this process, we've really worked to engage with partners throughout the region, and we've had many conversations with a variety of experts and stakeholders throughout the region, but also we convened a group to engage with some of our partners on a more regular basis. And the group met several times throughout the past year and a half, really to review our assessment of the equity of fees, fines, and fares. It's kind of a tongue twister, fees, fines, and fares, and to really help also identify strategies to reduce some of those impacts and help us think through how to proceed. You can see our resource group on the slide. We have transit agencies, the Tollway, Cook County, City of Chicago, as well as others from the Center for Neighborhood Technology, the Equity Institute through the YWCA of Evanston, UIC researchers, Metropolitan Planning Council, and others. Next slide, please. And as a part of the process, we started by selecting several fees, fines, and fares to evaluate, and we did this in consultation with that group that you just saw on the previous slide. We looked at the motor fuel tax and also Onto 2050's recommendation for a proposed road usage charge. We looked at traffic violations and delinquency fines. We looked at transit fares, tolling, priced parking. We looked at state and local motor vehicle registration fees, and we also looked at TNC fees, such as those the City of Chicago and a couple suburbs currently impose on Uber and Lyft rides. And we wanted to understand, one, to what degree are residents with lower incomes impacted by these transportation fees, fines, and fares? And also, are residents with lower incomes actually disproportionately burdened by these fees, fines, and fares? Next slide, please. And actually, before I move on to challenges, I did want to ask if anybody had any questions for me on the scope of the project before proceeding.
Apparently none. Go ahead.
Okay, cool. Well, I will then start off by sharing just some of the challenges that the region has in improving equity in the transportation network. Next slide, please. So first off, one large challenge really is that nearly 12% of residents of the larger Chicago metropolitan area live in poverty. That rate's greater for residents living with disabilities, as well as for residents who are Black or of Hispanic or Latino origin. Next slide, please. In our analysis of consumer expenditure data for the region, as well as national data, really indicates that people in poverty often struggle to pay for even basic expenses. And often they're also unbanked or underbanked. And what does that mean? That means that they lack access to or ability to utilize a bank account like many other households are. And in Illinois, it's estimated that about 41% of households with an annual income under $30,000 are actually unbanked or underbanked. Next slide, please. And for these households, really any expense, including the costs of transportation to work, to school, and really to everyday activities is often unaffordable. the cost of owning a vehicle is high, and many of the households in the region with low income and residents of color lack access to transit options that connect them to jobs within a reasonable travel time, requiring them to use a car. Next slide, please. Another challenge, as this board well knows, is that the region's transportation system is really in need of significant investment. This is a major impediment to achieving the region's mobility equity goals, and particularly for transit, and that's what you see on this slide. The system is going to require billions of dollars in additional investment over the next 30 years over and above current sources, even just to maintain the system we have today. Next slide, please. So in terms of findings, we have extensive findings on the fees, fines, and fares we looked at for this project, and I'll just share a few of them with you today. Next slide, please. So first, more broadly, these fees, fines, and fares really function as a part of the tax burden as a whole, where any broad-based tax or fee does have the potential to be regressive if it's not based in somebody in a household or a resident's income level. The Nonpartisan Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy actually ranked Illinois' tax system as the 8th most regressive structure in the United States due to its flat income tax and comparatively low tax exemptions. This chart from their analysis shows total taxes paid as a percent of income for different income groups. And it shows that you can see on the far left, Illinois taxpayers in that lowest 20% of incomes pay 14% of their income in taxes and fees in total, while those in the top 5% are paying less than 10% of their income. Next slide, please. So in our assessment of specifically of fees, fines, and fares, we focused on households making less than 60% of the region's median income, and considered those to be in a group of low-income households. And really drilling down into some of the fees associated with driving, we found that motor fuel taxes, registration fees, tolls don't actually represent a disproportionate burden for households with low income. And you can see on this slide, these households tend to own fewer vehicles and drive fewer miles than households in other income groups. An average of 20 miles per day, which is less than half the regional average. And this impacts the amount that these drivers pay for vehicle registration fees, for motor fuel taxes, and also for tolls. Next slide, please. When we looked at these same fees, we found that these costs are actually a small part of the overall cost of driving, but the overall cost of driving does remain a high burden for households with low income without mobility options other than driving, meaning they don't necessarily have sufficient access to the transit network. And even though many of these households do drive less and own fewer vehicles, because it's so expensive, they still drive if they lack access to transit. And most households with low income do own or lease a vehicle, and that results in them needing to spend a lot on transportation. Next slide, please. Our analysis indicates that households with low income in the Chicago area spend 16% of their income on transportation. And you can see in this chart, households with more income are able to dedicate less of their income to transportation costs on average. And most household transportation costs are for owning and maintaining a vehicle, and just a small portion of these costs are attributable to transportation fees, fines, and fares. Next slide, please. So households and residents of all income levels in northeastern Illinois do rely on transit, but it tends to be especially crucial for residents with lower incomes. Our modeling indicates that households with low income actually take 20% more transit trips than other households. But when you exclude work commutes from that, these households actually take twice as many trips. And that indicates to us that they're more likely to use transit for trips that are just required to live their daily lives, like to go shopping and make other required trips. Next slide, please. We found that the cost of a fare tends to vary by a variety of factors, and some of those can result in the cost of taking transit to comprise of a relatively high share of earnings for a household with low income. For example, you see on this chart, we have an overview of the annual cost of buying transit monthly passes as a percent of income with some example incomes, and can see the purple in for lower income, that green for medium, and high in teal. And you can see that it does get relatively high for households with low income. Next slide, please. Moving into traffic violation fines. When we looked at traffic violation fine amounts, we did find that lower income households pay a substantially larger share of weekly wages on any given fine than households with higher incomes. And with this higher burden, some drivers wind up being unable to pay their fines, and that can result in late fees. Next slide, please. And these traffic fines and the associated fees can really compound and become a major source of debt for residents with lower incomes. And people with fine debt may experience bankruptcy, tax garnishment, and just generally damage to their credit score. Next slide, please. So before I move on to the recommendations, I did want to ask if anyone has any questions about our findings on fees, fines, and fares.
If I could jump in here, and I apologize for the pandemic pup in the background, but I just wanted to thank you for what you're putting out there. My understanding in connection with a health access project that I was working on is that Lake County has been identified as one of the highest in the nation in terms of people lacking cars, and with the resultant lack of access to transit, it really is a transportation desert for a lot of folks, especially low-income folks, resulting in devastating impacts on economic development, access to healthcare, access to post-secondary education, frankly, access to housing. People are really trapped. So I appreciate you highlighting all of these elements. And in my role as Lake County's rep, I just wanted to highlight that specific issue for this huge geographic area where people are truly locked because of lack of access to cars and really de minimis public transit. East-west transportation in particular, or travel, is very, very difficult for a significant portion of the population in Lake County. Thanks.
Thank you. And that's very consistent with our findings on this, and I appreciate your framing that in the Lake County context. Anything else before I move into the next steps and opportunities to advance equity?
Lindsay, this is Rick Reinbold. I have a quick question. Curious if you were able to look in your analysis at the Cook County Fair Transit program that reduces fares on the Metro, the Rock Island, and also partners with PACE. I'm just curious if you've looked at, and it's really early in that program, but curious to see if that may be a model for helping to address some of these inequities in the future or down the road. I'm curious of your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think it is potentially a model to help reduce equities down the road. We did not, because that is so new, we didn't assess that as part of our analysis per se, but I do think that it fits well within some of the opportunities that we see moving forward. And I do think it should be something that we'll look at moving forward to see whether or not there are other opportunities like that in the region to help residents with low income access the transit network.
Very good. Thank you.
This is Diane Williams. If I can just tag onto that a little bit, because I think the program is a great program and hope it will prove to be a model that can be used in other places. But I'm really concerned that the pandemic will have a significant impact in terms of masking, quite frankly, the kind of results we might ordinarily get. I'm wondering what you're thinking about that and how you are managing that.
Great question. I think that just generally how to think about the pandemic and impacts to the pandemic on a number of things, including the results of any pilot program, and even just looking at trying to forecast things like revenues. We're going to have to try and think about how to look at look at 2020, 2021. We're going to be doing that, I know, to some extent through our mobility recovery work, really looking at what some of the impacts are and how to think about those and how to think about how they will reflect things moving forward. So we're thinking about that. I don't have an answer. I don't have a direct answer for you right now, but we're very cognizant that that's an issue when we're evaluating or analyzing really anything that's happening at this moment.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I just don't want to see the program derailed by circumstances.
Absolutely.
Lindsay, I have a follow-up to that too. I'm thinking pandemic timing is everything, to have been doing your this study over the time of the pandemic. Out here where we've experienced such a drastic decrease in ridership, Metro Transit out in suburbia, all across Chicago, 100,000 foot view of this thing in my mind, and I'm sure you're thinking this way, needs to be incentivizing people to get back onto Metro. And so looking at fares, Metro being one of them, or even parking fees downtown, in the greater scheme of things, if people out in suburbia choose not to return to working in Chicago, the overall impact on low income residents may be, catastrophic. I mean, for all of us, really, in the sense that Chicago is such a driver of our region's economy. So I think because of the pandemic, we really have to be concerned about incentivizing people who now have a choice. If they're going to work from home, as many of my residents do, our Northwest suburban residents do, and decide not to come back in, if increasing fares on people who aren't low income becomes a disincentive for them to return to Chicago, I think that's going to be a big issue for all of us. So I'm just kind of throwing that out there, that looking at transit in a vacuum, or transit equity, transportation equity in a vacuum, is probably going to be something we're not going to have the luxury of being able to do in the same way we might have before. So just saying.
Absolutely. And if you guys are all ready, I can move on to some of the recommendations. One of the things that we tried to think about when looking at next opportunities is how to balance, a lot of different competing issues, including making sure that that there's enough revenue. I mean, improving mobility for residents of low income is going to require significant investments in transit access, and we don't want to find ourselves in a situation where we have significantly lower ridership just generally, because that will reduce the amount of revenues available for the transit network in general. Also, and I'll get into these recommendations in a second, many of them will require additional funding to really just administer programs or recoup revenue that might be lost if you're reducing fees or fares. So I think that balancing all of these things to make sure there's enough revenue for the transportation system in the region is key. So looking at these recommendations, the CMAP and the resource group considered a variety of strategies beyond the ones you see here to really determine which ones are going to best meet the goals of reducing impacts on residents of low income, but then also, again, like I said, making sure that we really do have enough revenue to meet transportation needs in the region. And I'll just go through these one by one. Really, first, improve mobility options. That's really a hallmark of Unto 2050, though. An effective way to reduce the impact of transportation costs overall is, as well as the cost of just fees, fines, and fares, is to just provide people the option not to drive. And to do that, we just need to work towards implementing these Unto 2050 recommendations to make more investments and lower cost mobility options like transit and also bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure. Next one, looking at just introducing more progressivity into the income tax. That's going to reduce the regressiveness of the overall tax burden, and that can mitigate any impacts of transportation fees, fines, and fares, as well as generally other sales and excise taxes. And to do this, there's a number of ways the state could do this. Reduce the income tax burden through increasing the personal exemption, through implementing graduated rates, also expanding or increasing the state earned income tax credit. Those are all potential options to do that. Next one, looking at just generally making transportation fees more affordable for households with low income. There are several ways that we looked at achieving that goal. One, and this kind of gets to what I was talking about before, expanding reduced transit fares and vehicle registration fees to all households with low income. Currently, just low income residents who are seniors or who have disabilities are eligible for reduced fares or vehicle fees. Also, we'd even like to look at potentially restructuring vehicle fees to be based on vehicle value, and then moving forward as other entities implement TNC fees, looking to align those with regional transit goals. Next, improve access to lower cost tools for households with low income. So there are also several ways to do that. And there are several current ways that people lower the fees and fares that they pay, either through using an iPass, using Ventra, or accessing the Transit Benefit Fare Program. So for iPass, it turns out that the tollway has already been looking at an expansion to iPass Assist to help more low-income drivers be able to access the iPass transponders that provide a lower rate as part of their announcement to end cash tolls. But even if we eliminate the deposit on that transponder for expanded number of eligible households, in the long term, we think it's important to develop a lower cost alternative to the iPass and transponders, and that could just reduce the need to require a deposit in the first place. Also, just continuing to look at efforts to help riders utilize Ventra and encourage even more employers to participate in that Transit Benefit Fare Program that provides the income tax reduction on the money that you spend in transit fares. Next, we'd like to look at piloting initiatives that coordinate fee and fare collection. So residents have to navigate a variety of public agencies to pay their fees and fares, and just making it easier for them to pay will increase compliance and also might reduce the incidence of late fees and fines, which as you saw on some prior slides would really be helpful for many households with low income. This could include initiatives to allow people to obtain an iPass or pay vehicle fees at a place like the Illinois Secretary of State or other publicly accessible facilities or additional retailers. Also, this includes I-2 2050's recommendation to implement full fare integration across service providers, including transit services and other modes of transportation. Next, making paying for parking just more feasible for residents and delivery drivers. It's important that there's short-term parking that can be paid with a variety of payment options, not just a credit card, because as I mentioned before, many residents are unbanked, and also finding ways for short-term parking to have limited transaction fees. And this could help people and delivery drivers avoid paying parking fines. And lastly, implementing a package of traffic and fine reforms. So just last month, the state enacted some legislative changes that actually eliminate holds on license renewal and license suspensions for failure to pay traffic and red light tickets, but more reforms are needed. And for local governments, there are several areas to improve practices. That can include assessing fine levels to make sure that they meet safety rather than revenue goals, and also reforming repayment plans. But more broadly, we'd like to see fines structured so that people can actually afford to pay them in the first place. To pilot a new structure, we'd need changes to state statute that would allow for income-based fines or ability to pay waivers. Next slide, please. So I wanted to, at this point, one, just generally ask for feedback on the work, on the recommendations put together by CMAP and the resource group, and also just ask you all a couple questions, because we'd be interested just to hear how you think these recommendations are applicable to your communities and whether there are efforts in your communities that we really could build upon to implement some of this work.
Like Leanne has her hand raised.
Hi, I just wanted to actually compliment you, Lindsay, on this work. I think it's really good and insightful. I assume that the data that you're using was actually pre-pandemic data, so it's not specific, it's not actually being impacted by any current trends or sort of nuances associated with the pandemic. So I think that that's a good and important point, because I think it gives us a better look at, you know, the world. Yes, we're going to be different post-pandemic, but I think it gives us a better baseline than sort of looking at things through a pandemic. Back on your recommendations, I guess I would like to just also highlight, I know there's a study specifically related to fees, fares and fines, but I think your top line point really needs to be underscored about sort of going back to the recommendations, the broader recommendations in 2050, because I think a lot of times transportation is sort of, and the issues that we talk about with transportation are often sort of a product of broader issues, and a lot of that is driven by sort of land use made across the region and being able to access, you know, public transportation. And so I think that that's something that we collectively also always need to be mindful of, that some of these adjustments around fares and fees and fines and all these programs, while they're a good piece of the puzzle, they're only a small slice of it. And I think the way to really move the needle is to sort of step back and think more comprehensively about sort of the integration of the region as a whole in terms of both the nexus between land use and transportation.
Thank you.
Aaron, I have a question.
Go ahead.
Great, thanks. Lindsay, great report. You know, on the fees and fines component, and I'll give you a personal story. You know, so I come into the work to the office every day. I live in the suburbs, drive downtown, and as I was driving downtown today, I think at one point I was like 4 or 5 miles over the speed limit, and a light went off. Right, so I'm assuming I'm about to get like a $35 ticket for going 5 miles over the speed limit. You know, how does that impact? You know, I mean, 10 miles over is one thing, but 5 miles over in some of these neighborhoods, they're going to be racking up so many fees and fines that people aren't going to be able to pay those. So how does that fit into your report?
That absolutely fits into all of the work that we did, really looking at how different fine levels impact households of different levels of income. And we did find that for many households, this can be very unaffordable, unexpected expense. And really, and actually, can you go back really quick to the recommendations slide? Thank you. I think that what this calls for is, one, really looking at what's an appropriate fine level and looking at how can we really meet safety goals and use fine levels to achieve safety goals. And that's something that we think should be done on a regular basis, really assessing those. Also, we need to look at really reporting on the impacts. So local governments, the state can really start looking at reporting on some of the impacts of fines, and with an equity lens though. Also, the state would need to potentially pass legislation to do this, but I think looking at income-based fines or ability to pay waivers is really important here. That's something where that would just that has the potential to really globally reduce the impacts of any given fine on a household and make it something that they could actually pay. That's the thing about a fine. If you get a fine and you can't pay it, that doesn't really necessarily achieve the goals. So I think that looking at some of these fine reform issues as a whole package, I think is really important. But moving forward, we also, I think, will be looking at some of the issues involving fines as part of our safety work.
Thank you.
This is Jim Healy.
Hi, Jim, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Unfortunately, over my 25 years on the county board, I spent probably 1,000+ hours with our county clerk going over fines and fees and things that matter. So unfortunately, I know way too much about this and would love to forget it as I retire. The Article 5 committee, which I've had to deal with twice over my career. And second of all, obviously, I'm sure a few of the mayors that are on this call would agree that a lot of the idea for safety also is wrapped around the police forces themselves, and that a lot of the fines go towards paying for the police officer who is patrolling those streets and everything else. So it's a very delicate balance that I've had to deal with on behalf of our municipalities in DuPage County, and it is something that I wish you the best of luck in. What DuPage has started to do is doing a little bit more of the swap type work with the sheriff's office and also other types of fines, such as doing community service, especially for younger people who do not have any of the money. Those are things that I'm sure the judges are starting to look at. Thank you. That's all.
Great. Thank you. And that's really in line with what we're looking at. I don't think I mentioned this before. We also, it's part of the process, talked about, offering alternatives to paying a fine at all through community service or training.
Other questions?
I'll just share what we did. Oh God, the dogs. God, if anybody wants a dog or two, let me know. When the pandemic was starting and people were starting to feel the economic pinch, we decided to take our city sticker off line, and both because we wanted to help people who are having economic challenges, but also because we didn't want to have staff have to face the public and potentially be exposed to the virus, and shifted that revenue stream now to property taxes, which of course people are grumbling about, but takes again away the regressiveness of having sort of a flat fee for everybody. It now gets shifted to those who are maybe better able to afford it. And we're just going to continue along that path. So we've cut our administrative costs, but we've also reduced the burden significantly on those who are less able to afford that flat fee per vehicle.
Thank you. That's good to know, because we've been keeping track of those fee levels in municipalities, so I will be sure to add that to our list.
Thanks.
Thanks. Anything else, Lindsay?
I guess I would just say that we really appreciate your feedback on this. We are working on finalizing this work, and we will be putting something out in early spring on this. And then we're just going to be continuing to work toward thinking about how we can reduce disproportionate impacts on households with low income of these fees and fares through implementing these recommendations. And if any of you have any further thoughts, please feel free to reach out to me or Aaron. And I think that's all. Thank you so much for all the time today.
Thanks, Lindsay. We appreciate it. Again, a couple of those items are kind of outside of our box, so to speak, with a lot of things that would be implemented by the state of Illinois, but certainly if they're looking for studies, we can certainly provide them with that information, and along with the city of Chicago, with some of the most recent increases in traffic enforcement with Matt going 6 miles over the limit. So again, those are all part political decisions too, and I would think that both the city of Chicago and the state of Illinois, in consideration of what we have done in a study as the impact to low-income people, would be something for them to consider going forward. Thanks.
And Mayor Bennett, one other thing, I mean, I will tell you, if one of our goals is to increase revenue in the city at some point, getting a ticket for going 5 miles and over will definitely encourage me to work from home rather than driving in, but that's a different argument for a different day, so.
I agree, Matt.
Yep.
Thanks. All right, moving on. State federal legislation. Staff is on board.
Staff are available, but let me just say, since we last met, Governor Pritzker proposed the state's FY22 budget. This is the beginning of the formal state budgeting process. So of note, IDOT's budget remains largely the same as FY21, and the agency's appropriation includes the grant that has historically funded Illinois' MPOs. Last Friday's weekly update included a brief analysis of the governor's budget. Both chambers of the General Assembly now meet remotely, and the houses began hosting remote work hearings last week. So we continue to work with the General Assembly and our partners to advance our legislative agenda. So I'll just note that all bills must leave committee by Friday, March 26th. Statewide consolidated election is to take place on Tuesday, April 6th, which I'm sure many of you are well aware of. So we'll provide a written report in April, but I know that Gordon is on the line if there are any specific questions about the state agenda. I'll just note too, the federal Congress is set to take up the $1.9 trillion bill today too. So we'll, keep a close eye on at that as well.
Any questions for Gordon? You're off the hook today, Gordon. Thanks. And I know the mayors will get an update after possibly today or tomorrow's vote from the federal House bill that's hopefully going to be passed. And we will, Mayor Darch too, hopefully we get a better breakdown as to what impact that's going to have in as much as that money being relieved, but what we're going to be able to use it for. I think it's really critical and going forward. And again, my understanding is that money is going to go through the state to the city. So hopefully the governor will move whatever money he gets quickly to us locally. So. Okay, any other comments, questions, other business? Meeting's open to the public. Any comments, Erin?
No public comments have come in.
Okay, we will meet again on April 14th. Those who are on the executive committee, when you're done with this, you'll switch to the go-to meeting and we can move on with that. So with that in mind, if there's no other business before the board, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
Motion adjourned, Noak.
Second, Reinbold.
Moved and seconded, and we'll do this by call. All those in favor signify by a vote of aye.
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 Those opposed, the motion carries. Have a great day. Thank you all.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.